In 1972, 4 nurses vanished without a trace during a routine night shift at St. Bartholomew Hospital. No struggle, no witnesses, just silence. For 3 years, rumors spread, cover-ups, curses, something evil buried in the hospital's past. 3 years later, the city drained a forgotten canal nearby. What they found resting at the bottom sent chills through every spine in town. The murky water of Blackwater Canal sloshed against rubber waders as city workers trudged through knee-deep silt. October 1975. A gray morning, the kind that seemed to press down on Millfield like a soggy wool blanket. The canal drainage project was 3 weeks behind schedule, thanks to unexpected heavy rainfall and equipment failures. "Watch your step, Donnie," called out Ray Guthrie, the project foreman. "That silt's deeper than it looks." Donnie Miller, 23 and 6 months into his first city job, steadied himself against the slippery canal wall. His boots sank into decades of accumulated mud as he prodded with a long metal pole. The pole struck something with a peculiar resistance. Fabric. "Hey, I got something here," Donnie called. As he pulled, a sodden mass emerged from the muck, dripping black water. "What the hell?" he muttered, holding up what was clearly a piece of clothing. As the silt slid away, white fabric became visible, stained a sickly yellow-brown from years underwater. Ray sloshed over, squinting at the discovery. "That's a uniform," he said, his voice dropping. He turned over a corner of the fabric to reveal an embroidered insignia, a medical caduceus with the letters Saint B beneath it. "St. Bartholomew Hospital," Ray whispered, his face suddenly ashen. Within minutes, they'd unearthed 3 more uniforms, all identical except for their sizes. Then Donnie's pole caught on something larger, a leather bag, remarkably intact thanks to its specialized waterproof design, its brass buckle gleaming dully in the weak morning light. "Get the police here, now!" By the time Detective Harold Mercer arrived, a small crowd of workers had gathered. Mercer, 51 with a weathered face, immediately recognized the uniforms, white with distinctive blue piping. "Those belong to the nurses who vanished back in '72, Mercer said, standing up slowly. "Get the chief on the phone. This just became our top priority." As the morning fog began to lift, Mercer stared at the dark water of the canal, a chill creeping up his spine that had nothing to do with the October air. 3 years, he murmured. 3 years, and this is all we get? St. Bartholomew Hospital loomed against the twilight sky of May, 1972, its Gothic revival architecture a stark silhouette against gathering storm clouds. Once the pride of the city, the hospital had aged poorly, its facade stained by decades of industrial pollution. Inside, the evening shift change was underway. The squeak of rubber-soled shoes on polished linoleum mingled with the distant ringing of telephones and the metallic clatter of medication carts. "Weather's turning nasty," said Nurse Barbara Simmons at the third-floor station, glancing out the window as she handed over her patient charts. "Wouldn't be the first time," replied Grace Winters, accepting the clipboard with a warm smile. At 25, Grace embodied everything a nurse should be: compassionate, efficient, and dedicated. Her uniform was always pristine, her blonde hair neatly pinned beneath her cap. What her colleagues didn't see was how Grace's fingers sometimes trembled when administering medication. 3 years ago, during her training at County General, a miscalculation had cost a patient his life. The hospital had covered it up, but Grace knew the truth. Down the hall in the pediatric ward, Carla Rodriguez was arguing with Dr. Wilson over a patient's treatment plan. "With all due respect, doctor, Jamie's fever hasn't responded to the antibiotics for 3 days. We should be considering alternative diagnoses." Carla's New York accent became more pronounced when she was agitated. At 28, Carla was a force of nature. After growing up in the Bronx and putting herself through nursing school while working 2 jobs, She had little patience for the hospital's rigid hierarchies. On the second floor, Margaret Donovan methodically organized the surgical supply closet. At 48, Margaret had been at St. Bartholomew longer than any other nurse, 26 years of dedicated service that had earned her the nickname the General. Since losing her husband to the Korean War, the hospital had become her life. What no one knew was that for the past decade, Margaret had been keeping a detailed journal of everything she witnessed at St. Bartholomew, the good, the bad, and the increasingly troubling. In the emergency room, Iris Chen worked silently, efficiently triaging the evening's patients. At 26, Iris was the newest addition to the night staff, having transferred from a hospital in San Francisco 6 months ago. Behind her quiet demeanor lay a complex past. In San Francisco, she'd been accused of assisting in an illegal abortion, a false allegation, but one that had forced her to flee rather than face the scandal. As the evening progressed, 2 other figures moved through the hospital's corridors. Preston Wallace, the hospital administrator, inspected charts and supplies with critical eyes. At 45, Wallace had transformed St. Bartholomew from a struggling community hospital to a financially sound institution, though rumors persisted about corners cut and questionable billing practices. Dr. Thomas Reynolds, head of surgery, strode through the main corridor, commanding deference with his presence alone. Handsome in his early 50s, with silver temples and practiced charm, Reynolds had brought prestige to St. Bartholomew with his innovative surgical techniques. "Evening, doctor," called Frank Hollis, the head of night security, from his station near the main entrance. A Vietnam veteran with a slight limp, Frank nodded respectfully as Reynolds passed. "Hollis," the surgeon acknowledged briefly. "Expecting a quiet night?" "Never expect quiet, sir," Frank replied. "That's when trouble finds you." The security office behind Frank housed 2 other guards, Mitchell Davis, monitoring the closed-circuit cameras recently installed in key areas, and Robert Torres preparing for perimeter checks. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance as the 4 nurses gathered briefly at the staff room for coffee before beginning their rounds. "Speaking of storms," Carla lowered her voice, "I found something interesting in the medication logs yesterday. Schedule 2 narcotics signed out for patients who were already discharged." Grace shifted uncomfortably. Maybe it was just a clerical error? 3 times in 2 weeks isn't a clerical error, Carla insisted. Iris remained silent, but Margaret noticed how her eyes darted toward the door, checking if anyone might overhear. "We should be careful what we discuss," Margaret warned softly, her hand again touching the pocket containing her journal. "These old walls have ears." As if on cue, the lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness before buzzing back to life. Through the window, rain began to pelt the glass as the storm arrived in earnest. None of them could have imagined it would be the last time they would be seen together. 11:30 p.m. The storm that had threatened all evening finally unleashed its full fury on Millfield. Rain lashed against the windows of St. Bartholomew Hospital, and wind howled through the cracks in the aging building's facade. The backup generator hummed to life, then sputtered, leaving several sections of the hospital in partial darkness. "Third time this month," muttered Barbara Simmons, who had stayed late to complete paperwork. She fumbled for the flashlight kept at the nurse's station and swept its beam down the dimly lit hallway. "Grace, are the patients all right?" No answer came. Barbara frowned. Grace had been heading toward the isolation rooms at the far end of the 3rd floor when the lights first dimmed. On the 1st floor, Carla Rodriguez squinted at the medication log under the beam of her penlight. The inconsistencies she'd noticed earlier were part of a pattern stretching back months. Schedule 2 narcotics signed out under Dr. Reynolds' authorization for patients who weren't in the system. "This is way beyond sloppy record-keeping," she whispered, tucking the logbook under her arm. Someone needed to see this, and if the hospital wouldn't take it seriously, she knew a reporter at the Millfield Gazette who would. The hallway to the administrative wing was unusually dark. Carla paused as voices came from around the corner, hushed, urgent. She recognized Administrator Wallace's clipped tones. "Can't risk exposure now," Wallace was saying. "The board is already asking questions about the billing discrepancies." "The board," a second voice scoffed. Dr. Reynolds, unmistakably. "They'll back down like they always do. We've made them too much money to start developing consciences now." In the east wing of the hospital, Margaret Donovan stood frozen outside the doorway to the old hydrotherapy rooms, a section unused since the 1950s. The door, which should have been locked, stood ajar, a thin line of light spilling onto the corridor floor. Margaret checked her watch. 12:15 a.m. No scheduled procedures, no legitimate reason for activity in this abandoned section. Her hand moved to the small notebook in her pocket, and she jotted down the time and location. From the emergency room, Iris Chen heard raised voices from the hospital administrator's office. The ER had been quiet tonight, the storm keeping all but the most desperate patients at home. Through the partially open door of Wallace's office, she could see the administrator engaged in a heated argument with Dr. Reynolds. Their words were indistinct, but their body language spoke volumes. Then Reynolds looked up and directly into Iris's eyes. His expression changed instantly, anger giving way to something colder, more calculated. He said something to Wallace, who turned sharply toward the door. Iris stepped back quickly, her heart pounding. Without conscious thought, her feet carried her toward the staff locker room. She needed to warn the others. 12:40 a.m., the basement level of St. Bartholomew was a maze of storage rooms and mechanical equipment. Frank Hollis made his rounds with methodical precision, checking each door and noting anything unusual in the small notebook he carried. The sound that caught his attention was subtle, a soft scraping coming from the old morgue area that now served as additional storage. Frank paused, his hand moving instinctively to the service revolver the hospital had recently authorized night security to carry after a series of city-wide break-ins. The supply room door was ajar. Frank approached cautiously, playing his light across the darkened interior. His beam caught a smear of something dark on the floor, leading toward the far wall. Before he could investigate further, the overhead lights suddenly blazed on. When his vision cleared, Dr. Reynolds stood in the doorway. "Mr. Hollis," the surgeon said smoothly, "is there a problem?" "Door was open," Frank replied, instinctively angling his body to block the doctor's view of the smear. "Just checking it out." "Admirable vigilance," Reynolds smiled, "but I've just been informed of a disturbance on the second floor. Perhaps your attention would be better directed there?" Frank nodded slowly, but his instincts were screaming warnings. "I'll check it out right away, Doctor." As he moved past Reynolds, Frank radioed Mitchell in the security office. "Need a second set of eyes in the old morgue area when you get a chance. Something doesn't feel right." Mitchell's response came through with static. "Cameras are glitching from the storm. I'll send Torres to back you up." 1:45 a.m. The isolation ward was empty, not just of staff. That might be explained by the emergency elsewhere in the hospital, but of patients as well. Barbara Simmons stood in the doorway of room 312, her flashlight illuminating the pristine, unoccupied bed where Mr. Finley had been just hours earlier. "This is impossible," she whispered, checking the room number again. She moved quickly to room 314, Mrs. Cohen's room, and found it similarly abandoned. No sign of patients, no medical charts, no indication they had ever been there. "Grace?" Barbara called again, panic edging into her voice as she hurried down the corridor. "Nurse Winters!" The only response was the drum of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. 2:10 a.m. The hospital's main telephone lines went dead just as the storm reached its peak intensity. The backup communication system, which should have activated automatically, remained silent. St. Bartholomew was effectively cut off from the outside world. In the pediatric ward, night nurse Evelyn Tucker was becoming increasingly concerned. Carla Rodriguez had said she'd be back in 15 minutes. That had been over an hour ago. "Have you seen Nurse Rodriguez?" she asked, an orderly passing in the hallway. "Not since she headed toward administration," he replied with a shrug. "Maybe she got caught up in whatever's happening down there." "What do you mean?" "Bunch of security running around, doors being locked, something about a breach in the East Wing." By 2:30 a.m., the absence of the 4 nurses had become impossible to ignore. A hasty search of the hospital revealed disturbing details: an abandoned medication cart in the East Wing corridor, a cup of coffee still warm on the desk in the ER, a notebook dropped on the stairs leading to the basement. Outside, the storm continued unabated, isolating St. Bartholomew in a bubble of darkness and driving rain. Inside, confusion gave way to genuine alarm as the search expanded and yielded no trace of the missing nurses. "Check the locker room," instructed head nurse Judith Williams, her face pale with concern. "Maybe they left something, some indication of where they might have gone." The staff locker room revealed only mundane personal effects: Grace's neatly hung spare uniform, Carla's paperback novel with a bookmark at Chapter 7, Margaret's cardigan draped over her chair, Iris's precisely organized toiletries. 4 purses still contained wallets, keys, and identification. 4 sets of street clothes waited for shifts that had not ended. It was as if the nurses had simply vanished into the stormy night, leaving everything behind. By 5 a.m., as the storm finally began to subside and dawn broke over Millfield, St. Bartholomew Hospital was in chaos. Police officers moved through the corridors, questioning staff and securing areas as potential crime scenes. Outside the main entrance, where puddles reflected the lightening sky, Administrator Wallace spoke to the officer in charge. "I'm certain there's a perfectly reasonable explanation," he insisted. "Perhaps they left together during the worst of the storm, a misguided prank or some personal emergency." Behind him, Dr. Reynolds nodded in solemn agreement, his surgical hands clasped behind his back. Neither man noticed Frank Hollis watching them from the doorway. His eyes narrowed with suspicion, or the small notebook he slipped into his pocket, the same pocket that held a brass button found on the basement floor where he'd seen that suspicious smear, emblazoned with the St. Bartholomew insignia. Detective Roy Miller hated hospitals. At 58, with retirement looming just months away, he'd spent enough time in them to develop a profound aversion to their antiseptic smell and humming fluorescent lights. Yet here he was, standing in the lobby of St. Bartholomew at 7:30 a.m., surveying the controlled chaos of an active missing persons investigation. "Run it by me again," he said to the uniformed officer beside him. 4 nurses vanished during the night shift in the middle of a storm, leaving all their personal belongings behind. "Yes, sir," the young officer confirmed. "Grace Winters, Carla Rodriguez, Margaret Donovan, and Iris Chen. Last seen by various staff members between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m. Miller's gray eyes scanned the lobby, taking in the nervous staff, the reporters already gathering outside, the hospital administrator hovering nearby, clearly anxious to control the narrative. No signs of struggle, no blood, no broken items, no witnesses. "Nothing obvious, sir, though one patient claims he saw shadows taking Nurse Winters away." "Shadows," Miller repeated flatly. "Wonderful." He'd been 3 weeks from turning in his badge, from finally escaping the grim parade of human misery that defined police work in Millfield. Now this: 4 missing women, a hospital with secrets, and a city that would demand answers he wasn't sure he could provide. As Miller approached Preston Wallace, he found the administrator engaged in hushed conversation with a distinguished-looking man in surgical scrubs. "Mr. Wallace, I'm Detective Miller. And you are—" He directed his question to the second man. "Dr. Thomas Reynolds, head of surgery," the man replied, extending a manicured hand. "This is a terrible situation, Detective. If there's anything I can do to assist your investigation, please don't hesitate to ask." Miller noted the perfect composure, the practiced concern in the surgeon's voice. 28 years of police work had taught him to recognize when someone was performing rather than reacting genuinely. "I appreciate that, Doctor. Perhaps you could start by explaining why 4 nurses would disappear from their posts during a night shift?" Reynolds shook his head gravely. "I wish I could. I wasn't on duty last night. I had dinner with the hospital board chairman until about 10 p.m., then went home. But I've worked with all 4 nurses, and they're dedicated professionals. This behavior is completely out of character." "I concur," Wallace added quickly. "Our staff doesn't simply abandon patients, especially during an emergency situation like last night's storm." Miller regarded them both silently for a moment. "Then I suggest we consider the possibility that they didn't leave voluntarily." By mid-morning, the investigation had expanded beyond the hospital. At the Millfield police station, Marion Winters sat clutching a framed photograph of her daughter, her knuckles white with tension. "She wouldn't just disappear," Marion insisted. "Grace lives for her work. She wouldn't abandon her patients, and she certainly wouldn't worry me like this. Something happened to her." Miller nodded, making notes in his dog-eared notebook. "Did Grace ever mention any problems at the hospital? Conflicts with colleagues, concerns about patients, anything unusual?" Marion hesitated, then slowly shook her head. She was careful about what she shared. After what happened during her training, she stopped abruptly. "What happened during her training?" Miller prompted gently. "There was an incident. A patient died. Grace never gave me the details, but it changed her. She became more cautious, more dedicated, as if she were trying to atone for something." "Did she ever mention the other missing nurses?" "She spoke highly of Margaret, called her a mentor, and she mentioned Carla sometimes, usually with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. Iris, I don't recall her mentioning Iris much. I believe she was relatively new." Across town, in a modest apartment cluttered with books and artwork, Carla Rodriguez's roommate Jessica provided a very different perspective. Carla was collecting evidence, she stated bluntly. She thought something sketchy was happening at that hospital, especially with the medication inventory and certain surgical procedures. "What kind of evidence?" Miller asked, suddenly alert. "Notes, mostly." Discrepancies she noticed in the records. Patients who came in for routine procedures but were listed as having complex surgeries. Medications that disappeared from inventory. She kept everything in a red folder. Jessica glanced around the apartment. "But I don't see it here. She must have taken it with her last night." "Did she mention specific names?" Jessica nodded emphatically. "Reynolds." She thought he was performing unauthorized procedures or maybe selling medications on the side. And the administrator, Wallace, she was convinced he was covering it up. Why didn't she report her suspicions officially? She tried about a month ago, filed a formal complaint with the hospital board. Nothing happened except she got her shifts changed and was moved away from the surgical floor. Margaret Donovan's modest home revealed little about the veteran nurse's private thoughts. Her sister, Catherine, sat primly on the edge of an armchair, answering Miller's questions with careful precision. Margaret was exceptionally organized, she explained. She brought that same methodical approach to her work. Did she keep records at home? Notes about her work at the hospital? Catherine frowned slightly. She kept a journal, had done for years. She called it her insurance policy, though she never explained what she meant by that. I assumed it was just her way of processing the difficult things she witnessed as a nurse. Where would she keep this journal? She always carried it with her, said she didn't trust leaving it at home or at the hospital. Iris Chen's apartment provided the fewest insights of all. The studio was sparsely furnished with minimal personal effects. No family photos, no mementos, nothing to suggest a life beyond its walls except a stack of nursing textbooks and a small jade plant on the windowsill. "Run a complete background check," Miller instructed. "I want to know everything about Iris Chen, where she came from, her previous employment, education, family connections, everything." Back at St. Bartholomew, the search was yielding troubling inconsistencies. Hospital records showed irregularities on nights when Dr. Reynolds performed certain procedures, patients admitted under one diagnosis but treated for another, unusual medication orders, procedures that took longer than standard protocol suggested. More concerning were the gaps in the security logs. Frank Hollis had noted in his personal records that he'd been instructed not to patrol certain areas of the hospital during specific times, instructions that came directly from Administrator Wallace. "I didn't think much of it at first," Hollis explained to Miller. "Hospitals have sensitive areas, patients who need privacy, but it was always on nights when Reynolds had special cases scheduled." Special cases? That's what they called them. Patients who arrived after hours, usually wealthy, sometimes foreign. They'd come in through the service entrance, not the main admission area. Miller leaned forward. "Did you see anything unusual the night the nurses disappeared?" Hollis hesitated, then reached into his pocket and extracted a small brass button and a notebook. "I found this in the basement, near the old morgue area. There was a smear on the floor, looked like blood to me, though someone cleaned it up before I could report it, and I wrote down everything I saw that night, times and locations." Miller examined the button, standard hospital issue with the St. Bartholomew insignia. "Why didn't you report this immediately?" Hollis's expression hardened. "Because I saw Dr. Reynolds and Wallace talking to the police officers who first arrived. They seemed too involved in directing where the search should focus. I didn't know who to trust." As Miller pocketed the button and notebook, Administrator Wallace's voice echoed across the hospital PA system. "Attention all staff. Please remember that all communications regarding our missing colleagues should be directed through the administrative office. The hospital is cooperating fully with police, and we expect this matter to be resolved soon." Miller's expression darkened as he listened. The carefully controlled message suggested a concerted effort to manage the narrative. "I need to see the basement area where you found this," he told Hollis, rising from his seat. But when they arrived, they found the area had been recently cleaned and reorganized. Any evidence that might have existed was gone. "This was different last night," Hollis insisted, gesturing to the spotless floor and neatly arranged shelves. "Someone's been through here, deliberately." Before Miller could respond, a uniformed officer approached with an update from the search teams. "Sir, we've completed the initial sweep of the hospital grounds and surrounding area. No sign of the missing women. We also checked the canal behind the hospital. Nothing there either, though visibility was nearly zero due to silt and storm runoff." "What about security cameras?" Miller asked. "System malfunctioned during the storm," the officer reported. "No footage from the critical time period." Miller's instincts were screaming that something was very wrong at St. Bartholomew Hospital. But suspicion wasn't evidence, and questions weren't answers. 4 women had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of corruption and a hospital administration that seemed more concerned with damage control than finding their missing staff. Detective Eliza Collins flipped through the faded case file, her dark eyes scanning each page with methodical focus. At 32, she was the youngest detective in Millfield's history to be assigned to the cold case unit, a distinction she attributed to equal parts determination and the department's chronic underfunding. "The St. Bartholomew 4, she murmured, studying the photograph's paperclip to the inside cover. 4 women in nurses' uniforms, their expressions ranging from Grace Winter's gentle smile to Carla Rodriguez's confident gaze, Margaret Donovan's dignified poise to Iris Chen's reserved assessment. 3 years had passed since they vanished during that stormy night shift, and the case remained as impenetrable as ever. Collins had been a patrol officer when it happened, watching from the periphery as Detective Miller exhausted every lead, interviewed every witness, and ultimately retired without the closure he desperately sought. Now the case was hers, one of 17 cold cases assigned to her overflowing desk, but the only one that kept her awake at night. "Collins, tell me you're not still obsessing over the nurse's case," Chief Harriman said when she entered his office. "I prefer to call it investigating, sir," she replied. "And yes, I am. There are inconsistencies in the original investigation that Miller already pursued to every dead end in the county," Harriman interrupted. "Look, I appreciate your dedication, but we have current cases that need attention." "These women have families too," Collins countered. "Marion Winters still puts up missing posters every month. Carla Rodriguez's mother calls the station weekly. These families deserve resolution just as much as any others." Harriman's expression softened slightly. "I know, but without new evidence, there's nowhere to go with this." Collins hesitated, then pushed forward. "What if there could be new evidence? The City Council approved the canal drainage project yesterday. They're finally going to clean out and renovate Blackwater Canal, including the section that runs behind St. Bartholomew. And you think this is relevant because that canal was only superficially searched 3 years ago. The water was too murky, the conditions too dangerous for a thorough examination. If the nurses met with foul play, if there's any physical evidence." Harriman considered this, tapping his pen against the desk. "The drainage project is happening regardless of our investigation. I can't authorize additional resources for a fishing expedition based on a hunch." Back at her desk, Collins returned to the file, focusing now on the witness statements. Most had been thoroughly explored during the original investigation, but one nagged at her: the night security guard, Frank Hollis. His observations had been detailed and specific, but follow-up interviews showed increasing reticence, as if he'd become afraid to share what he knew. On impulse, Collins ran a current check on Hollis. The results surprised her. He was now a patient at Millfield Memorial Hospice, diagnosed with advanced lung cancer. Terminal, according to the medical notes. A man with nothing left to lose might finally be ready to tell the whole truth. Marion Winters had aged a decade in 3 years. Her once blonde hair had turned completely gray, and deep lines etched her face as she guided a group of volunteers in distributing flyers outside the Millfield Community Center. "Mrs. Winters?" Collins approached, identifying herself with her badge. "I'm Detective Collins. I've recently been assigned to your daughter's case." Hope and wariness battled in Marion's eyes. "Another detective?" "The last one promised to keep me updated, then retired without a word." "Detective Miller did everything he could," Collins said gently. "But yes, I've taken over the investigation, and I'm committed to finding answers." Marion studied her skeptically. "What's different now? It's been 3 years." "The city is draining Blackwater Canal next month. It might provide new evidence." Collins hesitated, then added, "And I'm looking at angles that might have been overlooked originally." "Like what?" "Like why those 4 specific nurses disappeared together. What connected them, beyond working the same shift?" Something flickered in Marion's expression. Grace mentioned something about a week before she disappeared. She said Margaret had shown her and the others something disturbing. That's the word she used. When I asked what, she said it was better if I didn't know, in case anything happened. Collins felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the sensation of a case cracking open just slightly. Did she elaborate at all? No, but she was troubled by it. Grace wasn't one to exaggerate or create drama. If she said it was disturbing, it must have been serious. Millfield Memorial Hospice occupied a converted Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. Collins found Frank Hollis in the garden, seated in a wheelchair, his once robust frame now thin and fragile beneath a plaid blanket. "Mr. Hollis, I'm Detective Collins, Millfield Police." Hollis regarded her with sharp eyes that belied his physical deterioration. Another cop, you people only show up when you think someone's about to die and might finally talk. Collins smiled slightly. Is that what's happening here? Maybe. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. Depends what you're asking about. The night the nurses disappeared from St. Bartholomew, May 15, 1972. Hollis's expression darkened. What makes you think I know more than I told Detective Miller? Because your witness statements changed over time. Your first account was detailed, specific. Later statements became vague, contradictory. That usually happens when someone's afraid to tell the truth. Or when someone's been told to shut up or else, Hollis countered, a bitter edge to his voice. You're right, though. I saw more than I said. Didn't matter in the end. No one could prove anything. And those who tried found themselves suddenly unemployable, or worse. I'm not afraid of threats, Mr. Hollis. And you? Collins glanced meaningfully at the hospice building behind them. Have nothing left to lose, he finished for her. True enough. He was silent for a long moment, gazing across the manicured lawn as if seeing something far beyond it. That night was wrong from the start. Storm, power outages, sure, but something else too. Reynolds and Wallace were both there, which was unusual for a Wednesday night. They had visitors, men in expensive suits, speaking with foreign accents. I was told to stay away from the east wing and the basement level between midnight and 2 a.m. Did you? Officially, yes. Unofficially, I did my job. Hollis's weathered hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair. I saw Nurse Rodriguez near the administration offices around midnight, looking at some kind of logbook. Later, I spotted Nurse Donovan outside the old hydrotherapy rooms. She was writing in that journal she always carried. Both of them looked worried. What about Winters and Chen? Nurse Winters was checking on patients in isolation when the power first fluctuated. Chen was in the ER, but it was quiet that night. Around 12:30, I saw her heading toward the staff locker room in a hurry. Collins leaned forward. And then? Then I heard something from the basement, went to check and found that supply room door open, the one near the old morgue. There was blood on the floor. Not much, but fresh. And that button I gave Miller. While I was looking, Reynolds showed up, tried to send me away. I pretended to go, but doubled back and saw him and Wallace with two orderlies I didn't recognize, moving something heavy wrapped in plastic toward the service entrance. Something? Or someone? Hollis met her gaze steadily. It was body-shaped. Could have been medical waste, I suppose, but they weren't taking it to the incinerator. They were loading it into a van parked at the service dock, the same dock that connects to the Canal path. Did you see the nurses after that? Number. But I heard Nurse Rodriguez scream, just once, cut off suddenly. It came from the direction of the old record storage room near administration. By the time I got there, the door was locked, and Wallace was standing in the hallway claiming it was just equipment falling over. Collins absorbed this, her mind racing. Why didn't you tell Miller all of this? I tried at first. Then my daughter lost her teaching job. My son's college scholarship got mysteriously rescinded. My wife's car brakes failed. They called it an accident, but the mechanic told me privately that the line had been cut. Hollis's face twisted with old grief and anger. Reynolds had connections, political, financial. He could ruin lives with a phone call. Where is Reynolds now? Running that fancy private practice across town, Reynolds surgical specialists, still cutting into people, still getting away with whatever he did. Hollis coughed harshly, a painful sound that shook his thin frame. Wallace disappeared about a year after the nurses did. Official story was he moved to Arizona for his health. Unofficially, I think he knew too much, became a liability. Hollis hesitated, then reached beneath his blanket and extracted a yellowed envelope. I've been keeping this since the night Miller retired. He left it in my mailbox with a note saying to give it to whoever took over the case, if they seemed trustworthy. He handed it to Collins. Guess that's you. Inside, Collins found a key labeled SB-M12 and a hand-drawn map of what appeared to be maintenance tunnels beneath St. Bartholomew Hospital. Miller found evidence that there was an underground passage connecting the hospital basement to the canal, Hollis explained, used back in the early days for bringing in supplies when the roads were bad. Administration claimed it had been sealed up decades ago, but Miller wasn't convinced. The canal drainage project began with considerable media fanfare. Local news crews filming as Mayor Henderson gave a speech about urban renewal and environmental responsibility. "We'll be starting at the north end, where Blackwater meets the river," explained project engineer Alan Dawson as he walked Collins through the site after the cameras had departed. "Working our way south over about 6 weeks, the section behind the old hospital won't be touched until at least week 3. "I'd like to be notified when you reach that area," Collins requested. "And if your workers find anything unusual, anything at all, I need to know immediately." Dawson raised an eyebrow. "This about those nurses who went missing years back? My uncle worked maintenance at St. Bartholomew then. Said it was the creepiest thing, 4 women just vanishing into thin air." "Not air," Collins corrected quietly. "That's what I'm trying to determine." As the drainage progressed, Collins divided her time between her regular caseload and re-examining the nurse's case file. Miller had been thorough, but he'd also been stonewalled at every turn by hospital administration. St. Bartholomew Hospital sat abandoned now, its future uncertain as developers and preservationists battled over its fate. Collins obtained permission to enter as part of her investigation. The building's interior was a study in decay, peeling paint, water damage from leaking pipes, abandoned equipment covered in dust. Collins moved through the silent corridors with a flashlight, following the path described in the witness statements from that night 3 years ago. Maintenance Room 12 was located in a service corridor off the main basement level, its door secured with a padlock that had gathered dust over the years of abandonment. The key from Miller's envelope fit perfectly, though it took considerable force to turn the rusted mechanism. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls, their contents largely undisturbed despite the building's closure. Collins pulled out drawer after drawer of building plans, maintenance records, and inspection reports. In the back of the bottom drawer, she found what she was looking for: original blueprints from 1898, showing clearly the tunnel system that connected the hospital to the canal. According to the plans, the tunnel entrance was located behind a false wall in the old morgue storage area, precisely where Hollis had reported seeing blood and where Reynolds had been so eager to divert his attention. Collins made her way to the location, examining the wall carefully. Unlike the rest of the basement, this section showed signs of more recent activity. The floor was cleaner, the wall freshly painted compared to surrounding areas. Using a pocket knife, she scraped at the edges where the wall met the floor, revealing seams that suggested a concealed door. Before she could investigate further, her phone rang. Alan Dawson from the Canal Project. "Detective Collins? You need to get down here. The drainage team just found something in the section behind the hospital." The canal was a hive of activity when Collins arrived. Workers in waders and hard hats moved carefully through the now shallow water, while others operated pumps to remove the remaining liquid from a cordoned-off section. Dawson met her at the site entrance, his expression grim. "One of my guys was checking the drainage grate and found fabric caught in the mechanism. When he pulled it out," he gestured toward a tarp spread on the bank, where several muddy, waterlogged items had been carefully arranged. Collins approached slowly, her heart pounding. 3 nurses' uniforms, the white fabric stained brown and green from years underwater, but the St. Bartholomew insignia still recognizable on their pockets. Beside them lay a leather bag, remarkably well preserved thanks to its specialized waterproof design, a luggage tag still attached to the handle. "The tag has a name," Dawson said quietly. "Iris Chen." Collins snapped on gloves and carefully opened the bag. Inside, protected by the waterproof lining, she found a plastic container, the kind used for storing medical samples, sealed tight against the elements. Within the container were several folded pages of hospital records, a small notebook with Chinese characters on the cover, and a sealed envelope addressed simply, "In case of emergency." "Get the crime scene unit down here," Collins instructed the uniformed officer who had arrived with her. "I want every inch of this canal section processed." The forensics lab hummed with activity as technicians carefully examined the items recovered from Blackwater Canal. Despite 3 years underwater, the uniforms had preserved crucial evidence. Blood spatter patterns on 2 of them, identifiable, despite water damage thanks to modern testing methods. The specialized waterproof leather bag, designed for nurses who often worked in environments with bodily fluids, had protected its contents remarkably well. Preliminary DNA analysis confirms the blood on the uniforms belongs to Carla Rodriguez and Margaret Donovan, reported lab technician Shapiro. No matches for the other nurses, but we're still processing fiber evidence that might tell us more. Collins studied the images, close-ups of tear patterns and blood spatter that told a violent story. Any signs of defensive wounds? On Rodriguez's uniform, yes. The fabric at the shoulders shows stretching consistent with someone grabbing her from behind. Donovan's has a tear pattern suggesting a sharp object, possibly a surgical instrument, based on the clean edges. What about the contents of Chen's bag? Shapiro led her to another workstation where the documents were being carefully preserved and photographed. It's like she created her own insurance policy, hospital records showing discrepancies in surgical procedures, patients admitted for routine operations, but surgical notes indicating much more extensive procedures, medication logs with clear alterations. And this? He pointed to a notebook filled with neat Chinese characters. "We've had it partially translated. It's a detailed account of suspicious activities Chen observed at the hospital." Under careful supervision, the sealed envelope was finally opened, revealing a handwritten message. "If you are reading this, something has happened to me. What we discovered at St. Bartholomew goes beyond medical malpractice or fraud. Dr. Reynolds has been performing unauthorized organ transplants and experimental procedures on vulnerable patients, harvesting organs from donor patients who did not consent. Administrator Wallace facilitates this by falsifying records and arranging for wealthy recipients who pay enormous sums for these illegal surgeries. Margaret has been documenting this for years in her journal. Carla found evidence in the medication logs. Grace witnessed a procedure that wasn't what the patient had consented to. We plan to gather conclusive proof before reporting to authorities, but I fear we've been discovered. If I disappear, look for Margaret's journal. She said she hid it, where knowledge is preserved but seldom examined. Iris Chen, RN. Collins read the message twice, her suspicions confirmed in the most horrifying way possible. An illegal organ harvesting operation hidden within a respected community hospital, protected by powerful interests and money. "We need to find Margaret's journal," she told Chief Harriman later that morning. According to Chen's note, it contains detailed documentation of the entire operation. "Where knowledge is preserved but seldom examined," Harriman repeated thoughtfully, "could be the hospital archives or maybe the library," Collins finished. "The hospital library, or possibly the city library's medical reference section. Worth checking both. What about Reynolds? We don't have enough for an arrest yet, but we should keep eyes on him." "Already arranged surveillance. His practice is booming. Reynolds Surgical Specialists caters to wealthy clients, many from overseas. Sound familiar?" Harriman's expression darkened. "You think he's still doing it? After what happened with the nurses?" "Men like Reynolds don't stop, Chief. They just get more careful." Barbara Simmons had aged gracefully in the 3 years since her colleagues disappeared. Now head nurse at Millfield General Hospital, she studied the uniforms, laid out in photographs with professional detachment that couldn't quite mask her personal grief. Yes, these are standard St. Bartholomew uniforms from that period, the blood patterns. She hesitated, swallowing hard. They're consistent with arterial spray and defensive wounds. You were one of the last people to see Grace Winters that night, Collins prompted gently. In your original statement, you mentioned checking the isolation ward and finding it empty, not just of staff, but of patients as well. Barbara nodded, her composure slipping slightly. Mr. Finley and Mrs. Cohen, both critical but stable patients. When I checked their rooms after Grace disappeared, there was no sign they'd ever been there. No charts, no personal items, nothing. Administration later claimed they'd been transferred to County General due to the storm and power issues. But when I called to check on them, County had no record of any transfers that night. What happened to them, Barbara? The former nurse met Collins's gaze steadily. I think they died on Dr. Reynolds's operating table. They were both listed as organ donors, both isolated from family, both unlikely to be immediately missed. Perfect targets. Did you know about Margaret's journal, or what the 4 nurses had discovered? Margaret mentioned concerns to me once, but said it was safer if I didn't know details. Plausible deniability, she called it. Barbara hesitated, then added, about a month before they disappeared, I overheard Carla telling Grace something about the hospital library, that Margaret had shown her something hidden there. I didn't think much of it at the time. Dr. Thomas Reynolds's private practice occupied a sleek, modern building in Millfield's affluent East Side. At 55, he had lost none of his commanding presence or professional polish. Silver hair perfectly styled, surgical hands manicured, his custom suit projecting prosperity and confidence. From her unmarked car across the street, Collins watched as a black limousine with diplomatic plates delivered a middle-aged man to the clinic's private entrance. 2 security guards flanked the visitor, who moved with the careful steps of someone recently ill or injured. Another foreign patient, observed Officer Jenkins, her surveillance partner. 3rd one this week, all arriving after regular hours, all using the private entrance. Just like at St. Bartholomew, Collins murmured. Same operation, different location. They had been monitoring Reynolds for 2 days, documenting patterns that increasingly matched what they now knew about the illegal activities at the hospital. What about Wallace? Jenkins asked. Any leads on his whereabouts? Collins shook her head. Nothing concrete. Official records show he relocated to Arizona in 1973, but there's no trace of him actually living there. No property records, utilities, tax filings, nothing. It's like he vanished. Maybe he did. If he knew too much, became a liability. That's my working theory. Reynolds tied up loose ends. Millfield Public Library's medical reference section was exactly as Margaret had described it in her note, a place where knowledge is preserved but seldom examined. Dust coated the tops of bookshelves, and the dated medical texts clearly hadn't been disturbed in years. I'm looking for any books that might have been returned to this section around May 1972, specifically anything that might have been borrowed from or donated by St. Bartholomew Hospital, Collins asked the elderly librarian. The librarian frowned thoughtfully. We do have a collection donated by St. Bartholomew when they updated their medical library in 1970. The section contained several shelves of outdated medical textbooks, reference volumes, and bound medical journals. Collins examined them systematically, checking publication dates, flipping through pages, looking for any sign of tampering or inserted materials. On the 3rd shelf, she found it. A massive tome titled Surgical Procedures and Protocols, 1965 edition. Unlike the other books, this one showed signs of having been handled more recently. The dust pattern on its spine was different, and when Collins carefully removed it from the shelf, she noticed the binding had been professionally repaired. Inside the front cover, a notation indicated it had been checked out in April 1972 and returned on May 20th, 1972, 5 days after the nurses disappeared. The borrower's card had been removed, but a faint impression remained on the pocket, which Collins carefully rubbed with a pencil to reveal Monsieur Donovan, R.N. With gloved hands, Collins methodically examined the book, running her fingers along the inside of the binding, checking for any hidden compartments or insertions. At the center, she found what she was looking for. Several pages had been carefully sliced along the binding and re-glued to create a hidden pocket. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook, its cover worn from frequent handling. "Margaret's journal," Collins whispered, carefully extracting it. The journal's contents exceeded even Collins's expectations. For over 10 years, Margaret Donovan had meticulously documented irregularities, ethical breaches, and eventually criminal activities at St. Bartholomew Hospital. Names, dates, procedures, payments, all recorded in neat, precise handwriting. The final entries, dated just days before the disappearance, detailed Margaret's growing alarm as she connected the dots between missing medications, unauthorized procedures, and patients who mysteriously transferred but left no paper trail. May 10, 1972 showed G, C, and I the documentation today. C already suspected based on medication discrepancies. G witnessed R performing procedure on patient K that wasn't what consent form authorized. I has been tracking patient outcomes and found disturbing pattern of complications in certain donors after routine procedures. We agreed to compile all evidence before reporting. Wallace and R clearly working together. Board members Thompson and Greeley likely involved based on finance records I accessed. Only 5 more days until we have everything we need. The last entry, dated May 14, 1972, the day before they disappeared, was brief but chilling. R watching us. C caught him following her to car yesterday. I saw W in my file cabinet this morning, claimed he was looking for vacation request forms. We're moving timeline up. Tomorrow night, during storm, when staffing is minimal, we'll access the records in administrative storage and make copies of everything. G will create distraction in East Wing, while C and I get what we need. If anything happens to us, this journal and copies of all evidence are hidden where they'll eventually be found. God help us all. Tucked into the back pages of the journal were several photographs, grainy black and white images showing what appeared to be surgical procedures being performed in unusual settings. One showed a room that Collins recognized as part of the abandoned hydrotherapy area, converted into a makeshift operating theater. Most disturbing was a map with locations marked outside of Millfield, rural properties identified only by coordinates with handwritten notes like disposal site and secondary facility. "Chief," Collins called from the library, her voice tight with urgency. "I found Margaret's journal, and it's worse than we thought. Much worse." Reynolds surgical specialists closed promptly at 5 p.m. on weekdays, but the lights in Dr. Thomas Reynolds's private office remained on well past 7 as Collins approached the building. 2 plainclothes officers positioned themselves at the rear exit, while Collins, accompanied by Chief Harriman, entered through the front. When they reached his office door, Reynolds was waiting for them, the picture of professional composure despite the late hour. "Detective Collins, Chief Harriman," he greeted them with practiced charm. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit? I wasn't aware we had an appointment." "We have some questions about your time at St. Bartholomew Hospital," Collins replied, studying his expression carefully. "Specifically about 4 nurses who disappeared during your tenure there." Reynolds's office was a study in calculated intimidation. Medical degrees and awards covering one wall, a large desk positioned to make visitors feel small. "We've been draining Blackwater Canal," Collins began conversationally. "Interesting what turns up after 3 years underwater." For the first time, a subtle tension appeared in Reynolds's shoulders, so slight most would miss it, but Collins had been interrogating suspects for years. Collins placed a photograph on his desk, the uniforms and bag laid out after their recovery from the Canal. These were found directly behind the hospital. Laboratory analysis confirmed blood-matching nurses Rodriguez and Donovan on 2 of the uniforms. Reynolds glanced at the photo without touching it. Tragic, but not surprising if foul play was involved. I'm still not clear on why you're bringing this to me. We also found something else. Collins placed a second photograph on the desk, this one showing Margaret's journal. Nurse Donovan kept meticulous records, Dr. Reynolds, for over a decade. She documented everything: the unauthorized surgeries, the organ harvesting, the wealthy foreign patients willing to pay for procedures illegal in their home countries. The change in Reynolds was subtle but unmistakable: a hardening of his eyes, a slight whitening of his knuckles as he gripped his chair arms. Detective, these are serious allegations without context. Margaret Donovan was known to be imaginative in her record-keeping. We also have Iris Chen's sealed statement, Collins continued, laying down another photograph, and Carla Rodriguez's documentation of medication discrepancies, and witness testimony from Frank Hollis about what he saw the night the nurses disappeared. Hollis? The security guard? Reynolds's laugh held no humor. A man with no medical training, observing complex situations he couldn't possibly understand. He understood well enough what body bags look like, Harriman interjected, and he recognized blood when he saw it. Reynolds leaned back, visibly recalculating his position. What exactly are you suggesting? Collins met his gaze directly. We believe you and Administrator Wallace were running an illegal organ harvesting and transplantation operation at St. Bartholomew Hospital. When the 4 nurses discovered evidence of this, you silenced them permanently. That's absurd, Reynolds scoffed, though his face had paled slightly. I'm a respected surgeon with an impeccable record. Perhaps not on their own, Collins agreed, but coupled with the physical evidence from the Canal, the forensic analysis of the blood patterns on the uniforms, and the financial records Margaret documented showing payments from foreign nationals to offshore accounts in your name, that's starting to look like a solid case. For the first time, genuine alarm flickered across Reynolds's face. Financial records? That's impossible. Wallace handled all the... He stopped abruptly, realizing his mistake. All the payments? Collins finished for him. Yes, according to Margaret's journal, Wallace managed the financial side while you performed the surgeries. A very efficient partnership until it wasn't. What happened to Wallace, Doctor? Reynolds? He disappeared rather conveniently about a year after the nurses, didn't he? Reynolds stood abruptly, moving to the window to compose himself. When he turned back, his professional mask had returned, but cracks were visible beneath it. You have no idea what we accomplished at St. Bartholomew, he said quietly. Procedures that were years ahead of their time. Lives saved that conventional medicine had abandoned. Yes, we operated outside standard protocols, but the results justified the methods. And the donors? Harriman pressed. Did they consent to having their organs harvested? Reynolds waved a dismissive hand. Semantics. They were terminally ill or severely injured. Their organs would have gone to waste otherwise. That wasn't your decision to make, Collins countered. And what about the nurses? Were they semantics too? A long silence filled the office, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. Reynolds's expression shifted subtly from defensive to calculating. I want my lawyer present before I say anything further, he announced finally. Of course, Harriman nodded. You can call them from the station. Dr. Thomas Reynolds, you're under arrest for the suspected murders of Grace Winters, Carla Rodriguez, Margaret Donovan, and Iris Chen. 3 days after Reynolds' arrest, the search team made their most significant discovery yet. Following coordinates from Margaret's journal, They excavated a remote property 20 miles outside Millfield, a former hunting lodge that Reynolds had purchased through a shell company in 1970. Beneath the lodge's concrete floor, they found human remains, multiple bodies buried over several years. Forensic analysis would later confirm two of them as Carla Rodriguez and Margaret Donovan, their dental records matching hospital employee files. But the investigation held one final surprise. As officers executed a search warrant on Reynolds' home, they discovered a hidden room in the basement, a fully equipped medical recovery area. And there, alive but severely malnourished and psychologically traumatized, they found Grace Winters. For 3 years, Reynolds had kept her captive, using her nursing skills to assist in his illegal operations while keeping her isolated and dependent. He had specifically chosen Grace because of her past mistake. The patient death during her training had made her vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Reynolds had convinced her that she deserved punishment and that by helping him save special patients, she could atone for her earlier error. Her identity had been erased, her will broken through systematic abuse and psychological manipulation. She had been told that her mother had died of grief, that the outside world believed she was a murderer, and that Reynolds was her only protection from prosecution. The search for Iris Chen continued, her fate still unknown. Blood evidence suggested she had been injured during her abduction, but no remains matching her DNA were found at any of the sites. Some officers theorized she had been disposed of elsewhere, while others speculated she might have escaped only to disappear to protect herself. Marion Winters sat beside her daughter's hospital bed, gently stroking Grace's hand as sunlight streamed through the window. After 3 weeks of intensive medical and psychological treatment, Grace had begun to speak again, though her sentences were often fragmented and confused. "You're safe now," Marion murmured, a phrase she had repeated countless times since their reunion. "You're home." Outside the room, Collins waited patiently, giving the pair their privacy while staying close enough to respond if needed. The past month had been a whirlwind of arrests, searches, and horrifying discoveries as the full extent of Reynolds' operation was revealed. 17 bodies had been recovered from various sites, most identified as patients who had supposedly transferred or been discharged from St. Bartholomew during Reynolds' tenure. The remains of Administrator Wallace were among them, bearing signs of surgical precision in their disposal. Reynolds himself remained in custody, denied bail due to flight risk. Despite initially claiming innocence, the mountain of evidence and testimony from Grace had prompted his legal team to begin negotiating a plea deal, an admission of guilt in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The scandal had rocked Millfield and the medical community nationwide, prompting investigations into other facilities and heightened scrutiny of organ transplantation protocols. Later that afternoon, Collins returned to the now-drained canal behind the former hospital site. The water had been completely removed, revealing decades of accumulated silt and debris, along with unexpected historical artifacts. Workers were beginning the cleanup phase, removing the larger items before the canal bed would be completely excavated and reconstructed with modern materials. As Collins watched their methodical progress, a worker called out from near the hospital side embankment, "Detective! We found something else you might want to see." The item, carefully extracted from the silt, was small and encrusted with years of mineral deposits. Collins accepted it with gloved hands, brushing away the worst of the grime to reveal a hospital ID badge. Though corroded, the name remained legible: I-Chen RN. Turning the badge over, Collins noticed something unusual: a partial fingerprint preserved in what appeared to be dried blood. Not Iris's blood, according to later analysis, but Reynolds's. Somehow, during her abduction or afterward, Iris had managed to injure her captor and leave this final piece of evidence behind. Whether she had escaped or been killed remained a mystery. No body matching her description had been found at any of Reynolds's disposal sites, and no record of her existed in any database after May 15, 1972. It was as if Iris Chen had simply vanished from the world entirely. Grace, when asked about Iris during her more lucid moments, could only shake her head. "They separated us," she whispered. "I heard Carla scream. I saw what they did to Margaret. But Iris..." Reynolds was afraid of her. She knew things, had connections. He took her somewhere else. 1 month after Reynolds's arrest, a small gathering assembled at Millfield Cemetery for the memorial service honoring Carla Rodriguez and Margaret Donovan. Grace attended in a wheelchair, still too weak to stand for long periods, her mother constant at her side. As the service concluded, Collins noticed a solitary figure standing at a distance beneath a large oak tree, an older Asian woman, her posture dignified despite her years, watching the proceedings with unreadable eyes. When Collins moved toward her, the woman turned and walked away, disappearing among the headstones before she could be approached. Later that evening, as Collins completed her final report on the case, an unmarked envelope was delivered to her desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a message in elegant handwriting. "Some secrets must remain buried to protect those still living. The truth has been revealed. Justice is being served. That is enough. I see." Whether the note was authentic or someone's idea of a cruel hoax, Collins never determined. She filed it with the case evidence, noting it as origin unverified, and closed the official investigation into the disappearance of Iris Chen. The waters of Blackwater Canal were eventually replaced with clear, clean flow as the renovation project reached completion. St. Bartholomew Hospital was demolished, its dark legacy giving way to a peaceful memorial garden dedicated to all who had suffered within its walls. Dr. Thomas Reynolds was sentenced to multiple life terms, his name becoming synonymous with medical corruption and evil. And somewhere, perhaps, Iris Chen lived on. The one nurse who might have escaped the nightmare of that stormy night in 1972, carrying her secrets into a new life far from the shadows of St. Bartholomew.